Okay, we have 3 papers in the session. The first one is about Italian firms in history, size, technology, and entrepreneurship. And we have 3 authors, and I guess Andrea Colli is going to present the paper as the first one to present the paper.
Yes, not exactly. Okay. I will present first, and then Franco, and then Matteo will conclude. Okay. Thank you very much. As you can see from the title, this paper's perspective is a bit different or divergent from that of many of the papers presented in this conference. We, as business historians, at least the 2 of us, we insist, and also Matteo ad honorem, we insist very much on the micro perspective because we are convinced that a nation's economic performance depends, among the rest, a lot from the characteristics of the system of the business enterprise, and we try to look to assess this point, looking back at the 150 years since the Italian unification. We do that in a framework which is basically provided by 2 exogenous, and speaking about Italy, exogenous, we want to stress the idea of exogeneity, elements which are technology and globalization. By technology, we consider the shift across technological paradigms and globalization waves of globalization, obviously deglobalization in the interwar period. The reason why we stress the idea of exogeneity is that basically, even though, or exactly because Italy is a latecomer country, it can avoid the impact of these 2 exogenous elements: technologies developed abroad and globalization forces. Very briefly, some definitions which can be familiar for some people, but we decide to stress in anyway. The story runs across 3 industrial revolutions. The first one based on a general purpose technology of the steam engine and an increasing productivity in some sectors, namely textile, metallurgy, and mining. The second, which is centered on mass production techniques and with the general purpose technology different, which is electricity. And obviously different sectors like chemicals, pharmaceutical, food processing, based basically on economies of scale, a scope. And the third industrial revolution based on ICT as a GPT, and accompanied by a diffusion of other products, semiconductors, and new sectors, basically technology-intensive industries. As far as globalization is concerned, the idea is that, the strong idea is that Italy, since the beginning of its history as a unified country, and even before, have been fully involved in the waves of globalization, in the waves, successive wave of globalization. The first one boosted by the technologies of the first industrial revolution and the transportation and communication revolution in the first industrial revolution, taking place basically since the 3rd decade of the 19th century, 1870, and the second globalization, basically the last 2 decades, and coinciding with the technological opportunities provided by the third industrial revolution. Given this framework, what is the evolution of the Italian business system, which is the Italian business history in this framework and in strictly chronological terms? We decided to start before the unification just at the eve of the unification, when Italy was basically an agricultural, a peasant society with very limited, and we want to stress this point, internal interactions. Differently from Germany, which unified in the same period, Italy had this additional problem of a very limited internal interaction between the parts composing, the geographical areas composing the new country. And notwithstanding this, the two parts of the country were separately involved in the global economy, and both basically providing to the global economy agricultural products and raw material for advanced countries. And this is a situation of globalization without technology, in some sense, which had some consequences on the industrial demography of the country, because until at least the last 2 decades of the 19th century, which was the business tissue or the business demography of the country. But basically, manufacturing activity in Italy remained marginal in terms of their contribution to GDP, and the backwardness, technological backwardness, was filled in basically by two elements with different weight, probably. The first one was foreign capital and technology that filled some of this gap of backwardness, but above all by state initiatives, which was the first important real financial and economic and industrial operator of the peninsula, which had to quickly build the necessary big infrastructure, while foreign capital sticked on local services and utilities, for instance. But basically, by the 80s, a first quote of industrial paint have been given to the country, using an expression which is not invented by us, but what happens during the last 2 decades of the 19th century is the approach of Italy to the first industrial revolution, which is a situation a bit ambiguous, because you have this approach of the first industrial revolution outside, in some sense, globalization, because you have protectionist policies starting at the end of the 1870s, but at the same time, and according to many, obviously, thanks to protectionist policies, was possible for some first movers to start some entrepreneurial initiatives that you can see in the slides, but we just provided some examples. Why is ambiguous? It's ambiguous because the last paragraph is telling in 1911, the year of the first census, industrial census, as known, more or less the total value of steel production is still equivalent to the total value of manufactured silk, which is basically an agricultural product or a staple product in bridging industry and manufacture. Well, what happens with the second industrial revolution? In our paper, the idea is the real convergence, and consistently with many of the papers on the macro perspective in this conference, the real convergence takes place in the phase of the second industrial revolution, which for Italy started in the interwar period, even though this is a period without globalization, but boosts and skyrockets in the years, in the 2 decades after the Second World War, what we call define normally the economic miracle. The second industrial revolution took place, and this is an important point, in this period, so the 2 decades, post-war decades, and the convergence is, first of all, in the typology of sectors, which are the convergence with the most advanced nations is not only GDP per capita, but besides, there is also the convergence in the typology of sectors, but in our opinion, which is, again, from the micro perspective of business history, is in the role of big business, because in Italy, in this phase, big business, so the top 200 firms, in our definition, accounted for around 1/3 in terms of total sales, 1/3 of the GDP, which is more or less exactly what's happening in the US, in Germany, and in UK. But in this case, the idea is that we have, especially after the Second World War, a convergence in technology and in a phase in which globalization is starting again, even though it is a regionalization. This is the European community. It's not the globalization of the last 2 decades, in which the story, according to us, does not repeat. Because back in the 60s, Italy was very well positioned, much like many advanced nations, to grasp the opportunities offered by the Third Industrial Revolution. But using the expression used Giovanni Dosi yesterday, was the catching up interruptus. This one, but, because only very few of these initiatives were able to survive, or because they were state-owned, maybe in energy, but we can discuss about that, or with some state support and protection. And what I want to stress, but Franco probably will pick up this point later, is that the opportunities Italy had at the beginning of the 60s were both coming from the private and state-owned side. This said, is now time to introduce another crucial variable in our discussion, and which is a kind of an explanatory role, which is the relationship between firm size and growth. If we agree, and I probably know that there is somebody here does not agree, that the success at the macro level depends from innovation, the ability to innovate, the ability to cope with the globalization, and the issue of being highly productive, is very difficult. Which is the relationship among these variables with size? It's not possible to find at the micro level evidence for the entire 150 years. We start from a strong assumption which derives from what we see during the last 2 or 3 decades. That is, basically, the characteristics that permit to a firm to be close to the technological frontier are invariantly the same across modern times, so we can infer back to at least the beginning of the 20th century, that there is a positive relationship between size and innovation and technology. I will run quickly across these slides because I gave these things more or less as known. A positive relationship between size and the ability to cope with the globalization, and obviously another positive relationship between size and productivity. But going back to what happens in 100 at least, not 150, but 100 more or less years of Italian history, I want to show you very briefly these two graphs, is that this is a simple disaggregation by is not industrial revolution but technological intensity, because we grouped the different sectors according to technological intensity, like low technology, medium technology, more or less scale intensive, and high technology. What is striking is this. The first graph is stressing the idea that the percentage of employees in large firms with more than 500 workers is steadily decreasing in Italy since 1927, and this is quite normal for first industrial revolution of low tech, but in our opinion less acceptable for what happens to the black and the green. And this is another telling graph, which is the share of the employment of top 200 over total employment by group of sectors. This is based upon a regression we made on using assets in order to estimate employment, because we have no data about the employment of the top 200 firms by sectors. And this graph shows quite well again then that the average dimension of the large company in Italy is going to decrease steadily after the 1970s. So consistently to what we learned from our colleagues talking about productivity or trade or technology, one strong idea that comes to us is that the absence and the progressive disappearance of the large firms has to do something with the loss of what happens after the 70s. This is not to say that small firms are not relevant. They are probably top performers in total factor productivity growth, but maybe this is not enough. And to explain what happens to big business, I think it's better to give the floor to Franco.
Why? I will read with passion, but I will read. Otherwise, I cannot make it in 5 minutes. It's not easy to talk of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs because it's tough to distinguish the actors from the environment. Take as an example for all the classic case of British entrepreneurs during the Victorian age. We will try. I think that in the Italian story, from unification onward, you have a major watershed. There are entrepreneurs who have the state as the reference point of their action, and there is a wide area of self-financing, of entrepreneurs more market-oriented. The former are clearly a minority in the Italian economy, but they are very visible, concentrated, vocal, really able to make a pressure on the political power. Their names are Pietro Bastogi, Vincenzo Stefano Breda, Pio and Mario Perrone, just to mention a few. As much as they are a minority, without them Italy would not have participated to World War I, with all the consequences that this brought. In the market-oriented area, we can find all sorts of entrepreneurs, from holders of small workshops to Schumpeterian entrepreneurs like Giovanni Agnelli, Giovanni Battista Pirelli, Giorgio Enrico Falk. In the 30s, there is an important and new typology, entrepreneurs managers of the newborn state-owned enterprise system, IRI. They were a kind of two-faced Janus, because they had to be sensible to the needs of the ownership, which at the time was the fascist regime, the fascist state. But given the general design of the system worked out by the founders of IRI, Alberto Beneduce and Donato Menichella, they could act as real entrepreneurs. In the golden 20 years after 1950, it seems to take shape a convergence between state-oriented and market-oriented entrepreneurs. People like Oscar Sinigaglia, Vittorio Valletta, Enrico Mattei, Adriano Olivetti come equally from state-owned and from private sector, but they all behave in the same way as great innovators, and they were leaders of large corporations, of big business. The magic moment, the moment when everything go well, had to be consolidated and further developed. This kind of moment, this kind of magic moment, probably was necessary that the state at the peak of the success initiated a privatization process. And there were people who really was of this opinion. Few, but there were. And were necessary institutional, legal, and political innovations, an antitrust law, a real protection of the investors in the stock exchange, promotion of institutional investors, an adequate banking law, the nationalization of electric industry will prove that. The ability to manage social unrest, inevitable given the social change of the years of the miracle. Only in this framework, large corporations could prosper, but the framework did not materialize. Politicians have their own responsibilities, but also entrepreneurs, top managers, capitalists, or whatever you want to call them, have their own. They did not take charge of those demands. They did not act as a ruling class. That is so true that when in 1977, Guido Carli, then president of Confindustria, proposed to protect the enterprise with a constitution, as there was a constitution of labor, one of the first articles was about antitrust, which scared to death the industrialists that he represented. It is well known that in the 80s big business was bank, but the new condottieri were the same rulers, and that season lasted very little. Luckily, we had to sign the treaty. We signed the Treaty of Maastricht, not only for the single currency, but it also because it compelled Italy to accept modern laws and regulation. But we are well inside the 90s, and large corporations in this country had already started to disappear. The stable doors were shut when the hordes had already bolted. How Italy could stay among the 7 or the 8 richest countries in the world, I will not tell you, because this is part of the concluding remark by Matteo Bugamelli.
Okay, thank you, Franco. I don't know if I will be able to give you an answer to these questions, but okay. For the conclusion, I have to recap what we have done. The goal of the paper, as Andrea and Franco said, was to try to look at the history of Italy, of the economic performance of our country, looking at the micro level as much as possible. So looking at sectors, looking at firms, looking at the story of the entrepreneurs. We did that using their knowledge, first of all, and some few data. And the data we used are census data provided by Giovanni Federico, and we thank you. We thank him for that. And then we try to use some firm level data, and this was, in a sense, the problem. We had this data on the 200 firms for some years of Italian history, and so what we tried to do was to connect the data on these 200 firms to the sectoral data, and therefore to the aggregate evidence. That was, obviously, there is a big jump. So the conclusion, looking at the sectoral data and looking at how the Italian economic performance can be related to the development, technological development that we saw worldwide, we got to the conclusion that you see in these 3 bullet points. More or less, we can divide the period of the Italian history in 3. We have a period before World War II in which our judgment is that even with some delay, Italy joined the club of the most industrialized countries. We could say that Italy was probably the only Mediterranean country to do that. So in a sense, this is a positive judgment on our country, on Italy. Then we have the period until the 70s with the economic miracle, and here the economic performance, in our view, benefit from the action of big firms, big entrepreneurs and firms that were able to catch up with modern technologies on one side, to face the international competitiveness in markets and conquer foreign markets and make firms grow, obviously with some exception, but more or less this is our synthetic judgment. Then after the 70s, so this is even looking at sectors, even looking at firms and entrepreneurs, the feeling we are having in these days, looking at Italian economic histories along different dimensions is the same. So after the 70s, something happened, and in a sense we can claim that entrepreneurial capabilities faded, and particularly the failure of big businesses in core sectors, in particular in those sectors that were very important for catching up with the new technology, the ICT, the information and communication technologies. There was the problem. So Italy was without firms, at some point, without firms able to catch up with those technologies, and the new globalization was another factor. At the end, no new technologies and an ability to face the new challenges posed by the last globalization wave. So obviously, we, as all the other, were searching for explanation. We cannot claim that we have the explanation, but obviously looking at firms, there is a variable that seems to be quite important in explaining these developments. I mean, positive developments first, and then a negative development in the most recent years. And obviously, as I said, due to lack of data, we cannot give you a proof of that. We cannot prove any causal relationship, but in a sense we are pretty convinced that the recent decline in the number and competitiveness, not only the number, but also competitiveness of large firms, suggests that there is might be a positive relationship between a diffuse presence of big businesses on one side and the wealth of a nation on the other side. And Andrea was pretty fast on those slides, but more or less using the evidence we collected for the most recent years, okay, we know that larger firms are in general, on average, let's say, obviously there are exceptions, but they have higher productivity levels and higher productivity growth. In a sense, they are less likely to be closed within the family. I mean, the family management is something which has a positive side, but also a negative implication are less closed within the family, and then we have observed that in these firms management practices are worse, and therefore these firms are less innovative, and therefore these firms are less capable of exporting in distant markets or doing FDI, or less equipped to new technology adoption. I mean, the smaller firms. I mean, the slide is on the larger firms, so I said worse instead of better because I just simply changed the subject. So this is more or less our conclusion. That's why we focus on this variable. We think that firm size is part of the story. Obviously, if you go to the last slide, it is true that if you look at Italy's economic performance, still Italy is one of the most industrialized countries. So we don't want to deny that the numerous small and medium enterprises has played an important role. Definitely, the comparative advantages gained by these small firms through different means, production flexibility, industrial districts, and pocket multinationals are some of the keywords that are usually used. They play the role in keeping our country rich when the large businesses basically disappear. But our conclusion is that at least in the last 2 decades, given the 3 big shocks that I don't want to list again because it's kind of, many papers are talking about these 3 big shocks, globalization, ICT, and the European integration, they completely changed the way of competing all over the world. So innovation, various types of innovation, international activities, technology adoption are becoming more important than in the past as successful strategies. And these competitive advantages, the competitive advantages of the small firms, do not seem to be enough anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. Now the discussant is Andrea Goldstein.
Thanks. Thank you very much, and thank you to the bank and the organizers for inviting me. And if Andrea can put the slides on, yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, that's a good idea. I will also tell you, Andrea, awake. And I couldn't resist, as you will see, the temptation in my first slide to put our own logo, because even if we are not Italy and we are not celebrating our 150th anniversary, also this is an important year for the OECD, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary. So my comments, the next slide, will be in a way very simple, because the paper is definitely a very good exercise at looking at what is by any means a very crucial topic to understand Italy's growth trajectory, and also, and this is the point that Matteo made in his final remarks, the current and very serious predicament that Italy is facing. So what is the role of firm size, and what's the relationship between firm size, technology and entrepreneurship, or actually entrepreneurship and technology, which I guess is the more appropriate order of the different elements. ABC, which are the authors, which is very easy, thanks again, cover a lot of ground definitely. I think ABC cover a lot of ground, but in fact it's A, that is covering a lot of ground on the history of Italian entrepreneurs, B, that is doing the work on implications of size, especially for export performance, and C, on the dynamics of corporate size over time. This is the richness of the paper, the fact that A, B, and C are great experts on each of, I'm sure they're also experts on the topics that are covered by the others, but it's but definitely they are great experts on individual topics. I think that maybe some additional work in better connecting the different dots in the different strands of their work could turn this paper into an even better paper where the whole is really greater than the sum of its parts. Because my main, in fact, I think that the way they presented the paper makes it better in a way than the way it's written, because the ordering, I guess the reasoning flows better in the oral presentation than it does sometimes in the paper. Next one. Some stylized effects. Basically, the argument is very simple, and to a large extent is one that is convincing, both in theoretical terms, but also for the testing and the quantitative evidence that they present. It's a very Chandlerian analysis, as you may expect from Franco, Andrea. Size is important because in any country and at any moment, in order to be successful, companies must spend enormous sums on management, invest in fact enormous sums on management, on production and in distribution. The three main investments that explain corporate success. Size is also relevant, and here I'm quoting some work in a very interesting book on the case of Australia, which is very similar to what ABC are covering here, because it provides firms with the power and influence to lead an industry or group of industries. And this is, I guess, the big problem, because to the extent that Italian firms have now become larger over the past few decades, they've been unable to play in the league of the big oligopolistic players in a number of industries where power and influence are obviously important. The testing they do in section 3, which is basically I guess Matteo's section, drawing on, of course, the available evidence, which is only for the latest period, their testing is very convincing. And it's convincing also because I will show you in a while, it's also convincing in other international environments. Of course, it would be even better, but that's not something that they can do unless some of the generous sponsors in this room are ready to put many millions on the table. It would be great to have the same sources and the same database, especially on exporting firms, that we have for the, I guess, 2007, post-2007 period. It would be great to have something similar for the past, which unfortunately is not so easy. I have two, on the size and performance issue and nexus. Two aspects, in my opinion, are a bit less convincing. The first one is the previous period. Again, Andrea in his intervention mentioned this. I think that work is particularly, I'm drawing here on the work by Barberini, Amidei, and Antonelli. They show that even in sectors which are characterized by small firm size, in the so-called miracle years of 1945, 1975, total factor productivity was very high. So in a way, yes, size is important, but that doesn't mean that being small in other periods was not was not enough to be successful. Another issue is size and innovation. Now, I think there is a lot of evidence, I mean, there is a lot of debate on this, and there is, of course, the big size is good for innovation argument, but there's also the other argument which is made in looking at the Silicon Valley experience, other experiences, but also experiences in the past, showing that, in fact, the relationship is not so linear, and in fact, in particular, there is a very recent paper on business history review on this issue of the role of a business. I mean, the role that business historians and business history can play in explaining innovation, drawing on the last book by Chandler, but also other contributions, and again showing that there are two strands in of literature, and so it's important again, at a minimum, it's important to acknowledge that the other strands can be important. In fact, they have a statement here where they say we consider it as a given that size is important. The profound characteristics that crucially make a firm to be close to the technological frontier and successful in the global economy are invariantly the same across modern times. Yes, maybe, but I guess maybe at a minimum I would say, as somebody says, or as we say elsewhere, but I mean something like that. Next slide, please. The summing up of the evidence, because they talk in the very first line of the paper, we want to know more about the characteristics and the strategies because of the firms, because those factors are those that explain the economic performance of the whole country. Very rapidly, the characteristics, again, this you just heard. In the first period, well, let me add something. I guess they present this periodization. It would be interesting also to look at the other papers in this project, because I think that especially the papers of productivity seem to suggest a slightly different periodization. And to the extent that, again, you make the argument that size is important, and certainly that the size of the universe of big companies has changed, it's important to keep a clear relationship with the evidence presented and provided by the other papers. But taking your periodization, now, first period, characteristics of big firms, they are getting bigger, firms and big firms in particular in relative terms, but still they are much smaller than peers. And what they do is basically they cater for the domestic market, which is still small, both because Italy is poor and also because Italy is still a collection of many local markets which are not interconnected. Then you have this longer golden age, so which is not just the miracle years, but it's not uninterrupted, but it's longer than just the miracle years, when basically big is beautiful. And big is a number of firms which are, I guess, in the paper by Onida and Berta are defined as the old protagonist and the once protagonist, something like that. So again, maybe also there, make some reference maybe to the other paper also could be useful, and the state-owned enterprises. And the strategies in this period, basically, first is kind of classical Fordist dynamics, both in terms of the way goods are produced and the market that these goods are catering. Increasingly, in the 50s and the 60s, exports become more important. I think, and this is a crucial point, because I think there is no analysis in the paper, or at least not enough analysis of the determinants of corporate growth, organic growth versus acquisitions and others means. And I think that again in this long period, 1950s, 1970s, especially for private firms, but also for state-owned enterprises, it's organic growth that is more important. In fact, I guess for the case of state-owned enterprises, there is also acquisitions, but except it's acquisition of rotten apples, not acquisition of jewels, but still there is also an element of non-organic growth. Another point here in this period, again, it's a pity that it's not mentioned, especially because the authors have done work on this, is the issue of the business groups, because you talk about the firms, but in fact in the case of Italy, in the case of many other countries, and especially in the case of emerging economies, and Italy in that period was an emerging economy very similar to the emerging economies of nowadays. Business groups are probably at least as good a unit of analysis as individual firms. Then you have the most recent period, again, which is not linear because there are different episodes, where basically at the beginning, for a number of reasons, small is even better than the big. Why so? I think some of the elements are there in the paper. The issue of industrial relations and generally policies, how do they explain? You mentioned, Franco, competition policy, but I guess industrial relations is another area which influenced the size and corporate strategies. I would say that Piora and Sabel as an explanation is probably more convincing in a way than Michael Porter. I think the flexible specialization model explains the success of the smaller firms in that period. And then over time, this growing awareness that maybe not, maybe small is not that good, and in fact is not better than big, and the declinismo literature. And then you have privatization as a characteristic, so the retreat of the state. The strategies, again, initially downsizing, very much in line with what happens in other countries. Globalization, increasingly, at the beginning is a timid globalization, then globalization and outward FDI dominated by delocalization motives, and eventually the need to acquire a market presence, even in emerging economies. Again, the other paper is as examples on this. Going back to the issue of the sources of growth. So from organic growth, more and more you see M&As and acquisitions as being an important level. There I think it's very good that Franco in his oral presentation mentioned the Capitani Coraggiosi, or whatever the definition we want to make, of the 1980s, which is not in the paper, because I think it's a very crucial period. People, businessmen, entrepreneurs in that period, including Silvio Berlusconi, of course, or Raul Gardini, were very important in that period. So again, understanding why these firms did not acquire the global leadership, or some of them, like Gardini in natural resources did, but then it was short-lived. What happened there, and what were the reasons? I think it's important that even in the paper final version you add that. Another issue, again, family as a strategy, I mean, a determinant of corporate strategies, the need or the willingness to perpetuate family control, and then the paradox of Italy being, because you mentioned FDI, but more outward FDI, I think also it's important to mention inward FDI, the fact that Italy has this strange paradox, is a country that is has received over time and still is receiving much less inward FDI than its peers. At the same time, there is also a country that each time that somebody tries to buy a yogurt producer, all of a sudden discovers that the national interest lies in direct products. So this paradox of a country which is open, in fact, to acquisitions, but at the same time is not attractive in general for FDI, maybe in particular for greenfield FDI. Next, please. I will accelerate because this is not for me yet, right? So going back, so miracle years. This, is the evidence coming again from Antonelli and Barbellini and Midei to just this point that big business, the argument you say, big business have often been the main actors of Italy's industrial development, and the slow growth of the last decades is accompanied with a productive system dominated by SMEs. I think, again, the point I was making earlier, are we so sure? If you look at this evidence, it doesn't seem that there is such a one-to-one relationship between size and corporate size and economy-wide performance. Next, please. Okay, now your aim is to provide an interpretative framework built around the nature and the choices of firms and entrepreneurs. And I think here maybe you should explore a bit more this issue of whether it's this sectoral specialization of Italy in general, or within sectors characteristics that explain the landscape that you describe in your paper. So just very roughly, does Italy have a few large companies because its specialization still lies in first industrial revolution like industries, where size is not so relevant for survival and growth, in fact, or at least this was the case until very recently? I think this has changed. Or is it because the inability of firms in first industrial revolution traditional sectors to grow adequately? So in other words, even the firms that we have that operate in this first industrial revolution traditional sectors, still they do not grow as fast as they do in comparable countries. Or another possibility is the difficulty or even the impossible transformation of second industrial revolution capital-intensive firms into third industrial revolution research-intensive firms that explain what you describe in the paper. This could be, for instance, the argument made by Patrizio Bianchi in his book. Or, again, is it the demise or even the shrinking of long-established large firms, or is it the inability of new entrants to grow? Again, I think maybe something, again, especially because you pay so much attention to entrepreneurship, is to have some data on new firms creation. And I think Italy is, if firm creation is a good proxy for entrepreneurship, in fact, Italy is a country where there are many new firms that emerge. And as I guess, next one, slide shows. No, next one again. In fact, Italy is also a country where firms, if they survive up to the 7th year, this comes from Bertelsmann, Scarpetta, and Schivardi, is a country where firms, again, if they survive after the 7th year, which is the evidence they provide, where firms grow pretty adequately. So what maybe the problem is not that there are no new firms, maybe it's not that they don't grow enough, maybe the problem is to survive those 7 years. Previous one, please. Looking at just the big business in comparative perspective and looking in the perspective compared to France, the picture is in fact pretty at the beginning of the period and in the last possible available years, the picture is more or less the same. A top 10 firm in Italy was in 1913 16% as large as its French peers, and now it's half as large. In the other categories, in fact, the gap is increased over time. So the problem seems to be persisting over time, and maybe, unfortunately, I don't have the data for 1961 or 1955, whatever. Maybe in that period this was not true, but next and next. So nature and then the choice and the nature of entrepreneurship. You emphasize the ability of some entrepreneurs to play in the major leagues. Again, in the oral presentation, you also defined that some of them, actually most of them in the 50s and 60s were actually managers. Some examples here. Now, is there really a lack of entrepreneurship during the third industrial revolution? Not so much in terms of the technologies that dominate the third industrial revolution, but in terms of the past 20 years. I think that there are many examples of ownership advantages. Again, the paper by Fabrizio and Giuseppe shows some of them. And also, interestingly, there are many cases of born globals also in Italy, from large firms, whatever, Brembo, to Grom, the ice maker that has more shops in New York, Tokyo, or Paris than in Italy. We accelerate even further. Another point, I guess the literature on entrepreneurship, to which, by the way, you have also contributed a lot, talks about the role of subjectivity, cognition, uncertainty, and judgment. Maybe to understand better whether anything has changed over the, maybe not over 150 years, but certainly over the past few decades, to see again, the main arguments I guess you make is that family conservatism, it trumps all other determinants of corporate strategy. So basically just giving the firm to your siblings is much more important than growth. Policies can help, which is something that you seem to suggest at the end, but maybe genetics, and there is a fascinating paper by Guizo and Rustichini showing that it's exposure to prenatal testosterone that it counts. So maybe Italians do not eat enough meat, and if they did, Italian firms would be much larger. So that is important to define which policies are important. And if I'm not mistaken, this was the last one. Maybe it is not. No, in fact. Yeah, so just some other important issues that may be covered. Again, it's the usual thing. It's much easier to be a discussant and provide a longer laundry list than to write a paper and remain within the limits of the length of the paper. Now, an issue of foreign capital, again, is mentioned at the beginning, also the foreign influence in general. I think over time the role that foreign capital plays in the universe of big firms is important to understand. Also, obviously, to understand whether the firms that are in Italy and that have been here for many years have really embedded into the Italian productive system generally, or whether firms came because they saw opportunities and then they just left or transferred actually the core function of the firms. You mentioned here and there the role of financial system and corporate governance. I think there is in the paper, in fact, I think there is in the room and in the conference a sleeping elephant, which is Banca, and especially in this paper, maybe it could be useful to explore or mention at a minimum the role that Banca may have played in determining the firm's strategies. Business-state relationship, again, you mentioned political entrepreneurs. Then at the end, you refer to a paper by Cingano and Pinotti that shows that political entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurship is always important over time, in Italy as in any other country for that matter, but still the characteristics seems to change. The political economy of business associations, you say that globalization is endogenous. I would say that the political economy of is all about making choices, and in fact one of the reasons why, if you look at the TH in Zurich Index of Globalization shows that Italy has persistently been less global in terms of its policies, not of the outcomes, than its G7 peers. So that has to do with, I guess, the role that the political economy of choices. The role of privatization. One interesting thing about the Italian experience, if you remember the 1992 or 3 speech by Romano Prodi at Parliament, was that he mentioned explicitly, which you don't find in any other country, the creation of, I guess he talked about a larger plethora of companies, business actors, as one of the objectives of privatization. As that happened, as not, certainly it was an important element. Another thing you don't mention, I guess, is that in the past 20 years, we saw these 3, in particular, firms, Eni, Enel, and Finmeccanica, as playing a very interesting role and becoming, in a way, the Italian giants in oligopolistic industries that we did not have 20 years ago. As I said, firms and business groups. And just the final point, I guess, the migration entrepreneurship. Outward migration was certainly important in Italian entrepreneurship over the century. In fact, for instance, one of the largest Italian firms is not even really Italian, is Tenaris Ternium, is a very good example of a binational company, which you don't find many examples around the world, so there is. And the other issue, of course, is inward migration now. A disproportional part of entrepreneurs in Italy are migrants, as you may expect, for a number of reasons. I mean, is that something that has the potential to create our own Googles over time, or will migrant entrepreneurs in Italy be as Italian entrepreneurs and specialized in the old traditional sectors? Thank you very much, and sorry if I overstepped my...
Thank you, Andrea. Now we can take some questions. Yes?
Well, 4 telegraphic points in support of this very nice paper, very insightful, and which I share. First one is Italy is, as you rightly remark, the only major country that reverse specialization from science-intensive, scale-intensive sectors using Pavet taxonomy to what Pavet calls a supplier-dominated sector. No other country, no other industrialized country has this reverse, and this reverse is associated, of course, with the changes in the size distribution of firms. Second, I'm glad that nobody raised the issue of well, size and the relationship between size and innovation is endogenous. Yes, but in this case we don't care, in the sense that it is true that Intel was small and now is big, but precisely now is big. Was innovating, was a serial innovator, and now is big. Italy has got, on the contrary, this, especially in science-based sectors, this vicious circle of low size, low innovative propensity. Third point is there was a vulgata. Andrea mentioned it in his discussion for 20 years or so that, my friend Jack Sable and others were peddling this idea that the second industrial revolution was a scale biased. The third industrial revolution is anti-scale biased. There is no evidence for that. There is absolutely no evidence. And if one looks at world rate of concentration by sector, well, of course they changed, but some even increased. Fourth point that resonates what Sandro Randazzo was saying, Francesco Sandro Randazzo was saying yesterday, commenting on a comment of mine. Yes, there is a major role for managerial failure in Italy. There is no developed, widespread technocracy. And in fact, I mean, the very fact that you are able to mention names, it means that there are very few. I mean, if you list and you say, well, there is Matteo, there is Senigallia, etc., it means there are very few. And against a tissue of non-managerialized economy, or people that were simply outraged, the Gardini of this world.
Thank you.
Two small question to the author. You're saying the problem is the size that small and medium enterprises do not become bigger. That's fine, but isn't there also an issue of large enterprises not being successful or even, failing? And the other question is to Andrea. If you can elaborate a little bit more on what you said about the role of large enterprises in becoming leader of the sector. Has this to do with, the impact that they could have on politics, on economic policy, or something else? Thank you.
Okay, so I think the authors can answer the questions.
Okay, obviously there were so many points that I have to choose. Yeah, exactly. Andrea and Giovanni Dosi, I think, answer a bit to the question on size.
Giovanni Dosi was a supporter.
Exactly, so he answered a bit to the question of size and innovation. Obviously, I mean, as Andrea said, the assumption we made, and we clearly state in the paper, that we look at the references to the analysis that have been done on recent data, which is the best thing we can do. Obviously the assumption is what we find for the last 30 years is valid for years before, is a strong assumption, I admit that. Obviously the paper you cited, we are going to look at that, but what we have done looking at the most recent data and what we have seen looking at the most recent data on firm level data and looking at innovation is gave us a quite clear indication that there is a lot of innovative activity among small and medium firms. We do not deny that, but when we try to measure the intensity or the innovative jump that firms can do with this innovation activity is not great. So, sorry?
Brembo is not enough.
Brembo is not enough. I just simply repeat what he said. Okay.
No, it's very important.
Yeah, no. Okay. So this is what we have done, and obviously we could relate the innovation activity to some firm characteristic, and this takes me to another point that Giovanni Dosi just raised, which is managerial ability. I think that this is really important. It's really important looking in the past, and I think it's really important as of today. Again, we played with some more recent numbers, and it's the perception, actually, apart from our numbers, there is a nice research by Bloom and Varinen showing that managerial practices in Italy are, on average, much worse than in the other industrialized countries. We look at the same numbers with a different, the same figure, the same phenomenon with a different data set, and we can say that our firms, on average, seems to have some managerial problems, and managerial problems mean worse management practices and therefore less innovation and so on. I completely agree with the point raised by Sergio Lugaresi that, I mean, it is true, we are pointing our fingers on small firms that are not able to grow, but obviously there is the other side. I mean, the large firms that, as I said, are few and not very competitive, so this is another issue. And I guess that, again, the managerial skills there can play a role, but I cannot say much on that, nothing, no hard evidence. I will stop here and then, so yes, we have time constraint. Thank you.
Very briefly, I will pick up other questions basically put by Andrea, which basically rewrote our paper. My suggestion is to publish also his paper. Well, the first point is about the comments concerning periodization. Thank you. We sticked on this periodization because I think this fits very well with the technological paradigms. And what's amazing is that in the interwar period, Italy was able anyway to start with the convergence in technological and dimensional terms with the rest of the advanced countries. So I stick on this periodization. Thank you for the comments about the idea of corporate growth strategies, which is absent in the paper, but we have also space constraints, but this is a very, very good point. I would like to stop on a bit, just a second, on the issue of foreign capital, just because I have a first knowledge of this, because I'm doing a research on this topic. Well, the point is that our calculations are made on only Italian firms, so we excluded multinational from the 200 because when you include foreign multinationals that we can do, is the story becomes a bit different, and in some sense is going to confirm our findings, because if it's true that today, 2001, about 70 among the 200 largest corporations in Italy were foreign controlled, and especially in sectors which were filling the gap at the technological frontier. This confirms again the idea that if Italian big business is not able to fill this gap, somebody else is there because the market is here, and then that's another point which is going in our directions.
Can I say something?
Yes.
No, Andrea was so eloquent and so speedy that I didn't. It's impossible for me to get everything what he said. I want to say about the innovativeness of the small business, that is for sure. A sound economy would have a community of companies, not just big business, and but the problem is that, because of course in a big company, in a large corporation, the innovator is persona non grata, because if he makes a mistake, it's the end. So small business is absolutely essential. But two are the case. Either small business becomes big, or the big company is going to buy it out. And also about the groups. The groups are not a bunch of small business. You know that perfectly. They are just something centralized without physical concentration. So this is what we mean, but we have to discuss a lot more.